I'm Wayne Lee, military historian, and when I have a question about film or television, I ask my friend, Anna Maltese.
And I'm Anna Maltese, animator and mocap performer, and whenever I have a question about history, I ask my friend, Wayne Lee.
And this is Hogan's Heroes in Post-War America. Welcome to the podcast. This is Hogan's Heroes in Post-War America, episode number 1, Selling World War II as Comedy. My name is Wayne Lee, and I'm a military historian at the University of North Carolina.
And I'm Anna Maltese, animator and mocap actor.
This is the first episode of our series looking at Hogan's Heroes, at its creation, at its making, and especially looking at the lives of the actors who played in it. But the podcast is about a lot more than just that TV show.
Oh, it's about so much more. It's about humor, it's about television, and ultimately it's about your wheelhouse, American history.
Yes. And that is a good segue to me. I always like to start a project or a presentation by talking about where does an idea come from? And in this case, the whole thing really started when I was at a military history conference, as I do pretty much every year. And I was walking back from dinner and I ran into 4 brilliant women military historians who were standing around the hotel outside, and we just started talking. And I'm going to shout out to them. This is Molly Sampson, Caitlin Ross, Brittany Huner, and Jessica Lupke. And somehow we got onto the subject of Hogan's Heroes in World War II and representations of women and representations of other things. And the longer we talked, the more I thought, this would be a really cool sort of, project, book, podcast. And in fact, what I was really thinking was that I had recently seen the HBO series, The Offer, which is a dramatization of the making of The Godfather. And ironically, the producer of The Godfather, who we're going to talk about in a few minutes, was also the creator of Hogan's Heroes. And the more I looked into the history of the show and of the actors and of their lives before and after the filming of the show,
which was wildly popular.
It was indeed. The more I thought this was actually a good idea. You know, some ideas you go to bed and you wake up in the morning and you think they're actually kind of stupid. I woke up in the morning and I said, this actually might have some legs to it. And I started putting together some basic outlines in a documentary style rather than a dramatization style, because we want to eventually convince someone in Hollywood to make the dramatization. I wanted to tell these stories, but I knew I needed help. And so I reached out to my friend, Anna Maltese.
And I put him in touch with Tess Rafferty and Chris McGuire, awesome comedy writers. Shout out as well to our sponsors, entrepreneur Heather Alvarado and author and extreme athlete Dane Rauschenberg, co-founders of Sherpa, the on-demand app which safely connects athletes with personalized training guides, as well as Tracy Mercer, former executive producer for Madam Secretary, who gave us incredible help on this.
Yeah, she really did. And it was in conversations with her and with anybody else, frankly, that we talked to about it, that we discovered that lots of people, more than we even imagined when we first started this project, have really fond memories of Hogan's Heroes as a TV show in their heart. They loved the humor, the hijinks, the shenanigans, and in particular, the repeated humiliation of the enemy Germans.
Who doesn't love humiliating Nazis?
Exactly. And then when you look at how and why Americans at the time embraced the show, and then you look more deeply at how it was created and who starred in it, you actually suddenly find yourself looking at the story of post-war America, warts and all. And that's what this podcast ultimately is about.
Exactly. Each cast member brought such a unique past with them to the production, and they blended those backgrounds into a family on set and into, from there, a wildly successful comedic production that was immediately popular. It was the highest rated new show of 1965 to 66. And then it continued for 168 episodes over 6 years. And then it went into syndication, and it's still available, of course, online.
Fortunately for us. And in the same time, the cast, as they're going into this project, they found themselves confronting their own pasts that showed up in the script in ways that they could never have anticipated, or at least I can't imagine that they anticipated. The premise itself was challenging and was, in fact, challenged by the public and even by some members of that cast in its early days, because this was a show about war. It was the largest war the world had ever seen. And it was a war that we're going to be talking about. It's a war that many of the cast had barely survived.
So the question is, how does comedy work with that trauma at the center of the story? Like, you were in the army, you can fact check me on this, but as I understand it, soldiers will tell you that surviving war can often be about finding an outlet in humor. But like, this was a show that was produced 20 years after the end of the war. So its humor was like satirical, not existential. It wasn't in the moment.
That's right. I mean, we talk about black humor or gallows humor as a survival mechanism for soldiers who are in stressful situations. But this is humor that's being pitched to the whole of society. And it's being pitched to the whole of society only 20 years after the war. So it wasn't necessary humor. It wasn't survival humor. It was humor that was making fun of something that was still something traumatic. And so the idea of doing that was at first controversial. And exploring that controversy, which is what we're going to do today, tells us something about a country and about its culture and about how it's responded to it and responding to and remembering its past. What people laugh at gives us a really deep insight into how they imagine the world and their place in it. And then when
Right.
you turn and you look at how Americans embraced the show and why they did it, and then you look deeper at how it was created and who started in it, and you suddenly find yourself again looking at the story of America.
Hogan's Heroes was an unlikely idea from the start, right? I mean, making a television comedy about a POW camp run by Nazis so soon after the horrors of World War II was never going to be an easy sell.
The idea originally comes from Al Ruddy and Bernard Fine. Both of them were newcomers to Hollywood. Both of them had dreams of working in Hollywood. Ruddy at the time was actually mainly working as a programmer at RAND, the Research and Development Corporation, that did a lot of contract work with the US military. But he was trying to work his way into the entertainment business. Fine, on the other hand, had done a little bit of acting, most notably in the comedic series Sergeant Bilko. Funnily enough, neither of them had ever written, but despite that, they set their ambitions high, and the ambition was to write a sitcom.
Grab that brass ring, boys. They didn't want to start with a documentary podcast first? Really?
Like, yeah, right.
The original concept was to have the prisoners in a minimum security prison, running circles around a befuddled Warren and like basically running the prison comedically. Although Ruddy recalled the script being legitimately funny, they were unable to sell the show despite trying for some 4 years. Sponsors in the 1960s were not yet able to imagine convicts as sympathetic characters, unlike, more recent blockbusters like Orange is the New Black or Oz.
Right. I mean, you can imagine it's going to be a difficult pitch, to talk about prisoners being the good guys, especially in the 60s. That wasn't really yet a thing. But then they got an inspiration from another network, and they heard that NBC was putting out a show that was set in an Italian POW camp, and it was called Campo 44. And even as NBC was already in the middle of filming the pilot for that show, Hogan's Heroes got into production and Campo 44 was canceled. Now, the way Al Ruddy remembered that story was that he read about it, Campo 44, he read about it in a newspaper, and they rewrote their prison script pilot in 2 days. They just sat down and did it. And 4 days later, I really want to know how they managed to make all those meetings happen. But 4 days later, they sold the idea successfully to CBS. We're going to talk about that story in a second. But Campo, as in an idea, avoided the controversy to come by having the POW camp run by decidedly unenthusiastic Italians. Hogan's Heroes, set in a POW camp run by Germans, is going to create and did create more controversy.
No.
Yeah, right.
So the first confrontation with the sensitivity of a comedy about Nazis came right at the pitch to CBS. Fine and Ready's agent introduced them to a room full of CBS executives, gave their pitch, and William Paley, the founder and president of CBS, a multimillionaire who had been made a colonel during World War II and served in the Office of War Information in London, just brought them up short, record scratch, saying, I find the idea of doing a comedy set in a Nazi POW camp reprehensible. Boom. Like total silence.
Can you imagine?
And yeah, well, I guess that's it. Let's just pack
Yeah,
it up.
right. That's the producer mic drop as opposed to the actor mic drop. You're done.
Apparently, Fine and Ruddy's agent just like sat there with his mouth open. But Ruddy was basically like, so I don't hear a no. And he launches into this version of the premise and the pitch. And he recalled later he acted out like a whole half hour of the show, complete with sound effects and barking dogs and machine gun sound effects. And at the end, Paley was won over and he bought it.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine going from full apparent rejection to okay, and at the level of a network television show. That's it's kind of incomprehensible. And interestingly, Al Ruddy took the paycheck, $40,000, and he also took a deal for royalties, and he moved on to other projects. And he used his success at selling the show as his calling card to get more work in Hollywood. And in fact, it was the calling card of Hogan's that leads him to successfully land the job as the producer of The Godfather. And the production of that movie was an epic story in and of itself, which, as I mentioned earlier, was dramatized in the show The Offer. Now, unlike Al Burney, as he was then known, stayed with the show as an associate producer, but only for a year.
Right. And ultimately, the show was produced by Ed Feldman, who actor after actor attested that he filled with a gentle aplomb. I mean, a showrunner can set the tone for an entire production, good or bad. And Hogan's success, from everything that I have read and heard, is in large part due to how awesome of a leader Ed Feldman was. His presence on set, his love of and care for the show and everybody working on it really helped build an off-screen family.
Yeah, and Robert Clary, who plays the Free French soldier LeBeau, at Feldman's death, Clary remembered that the series worked because of Feldman. He says it's a producer's show. And to quote what Clary said, he hires the writers, the directors, the cutters, the actors. He oversees everything, and he was very, very good. Not mean, never. Nobody could say anything bad about him. He was gentle to everybody. And end quote. And I'm a historian, so there's going to be these times when I say quote, end quote, because I like to get my sources correct. It's that central role in casting, which is our primary interest in this episode and in the next few. And so it makes sense to start with Ed, the role of a TV show producer and his particular view of what was needed to make a show succeed, where so many, even the vast majority of them, didn't.
You know, I've said this before, but given how many steps along the way that a project can just fall flat, it is a wonder sometimes that anything gets made in this town. Like ultimately, this failure rate is one of the things that makes a successful TV show such an important cultural artifact. Like, what were the ingredients that would resonate with the American audience? What would they see reflected back at themselves?
And Feldman had some experience. He had a steady career as a producer. And most recently, he had launched Gomer Pyle as a top 10 show. So he had his, if you will, his finger on the pulse, so to speak. He understood the kind of humor that would appeal to folks. And in fact, he moved straight into doing Hogan's Heroes from Gomer Pyle.
An interesting side note to that, too, that's actually where he met Larry Hovis, because Larry Hovis was on Gomer Pyle.
Right.
And Hovis would go on to be Carter on Hogan's.
Sergeant Carter. That's right.
Yeah. So the casting of Hogan's was also done in a different assortment of ways, because many of these cast were friends of those already chosen, and others were brought in for other reasons. So for the role of Hogan, Fine first suggested Walter Matthau, but Feldman believed he couldn't do comedy, which kind of seems like a weird bit of a diss
Yeah, he didn't
on
see that
his
coming, did he?
turn as Carson Dial in Charade. Meanwhile, Bob Crane, who had been and still remained a popular disc jockey in LA, was also in a recurring role on The Donna Reed Show. But disagreements there led him to want to move on and to stay in television. So he tried out for the role on December 22nd, 1964.
And ultimately, he would get it. And the next major figure to be cast was Werner Klemperer, who was suggested by a friend of Feldman. And there's that old sort of network working in Hollywood. But it came up as they were paging through a book of actors' publicity photos. So that's sort of, in theory, the way you're supposed to cast people, I suppose. You know, you look at folks and see if you think they fit. But then somebody sees a picture of like, oh, I know a guy who knows that guy. And that's how Klemperer gets his at least initial audition. And Feldman, when he was looking at Klemperer and thinking about his body of work, he knew him from playing serious parts, and he wasn't sure he could do comedy. And so, in fact, partly for that reason, they tested John Banner, who ultimately ends up playing Sergeant Schultz, for the Clink role. And they went back and forth for a while as to who was going to play which.
Which is kind of crazy because now that they're in those roles,
right,
you generally can't see them as, as anything other
right.
than what they were.
Right.
But if you go back to Operation Eichmann, where Klemperer and Banner were both senior Nazis cast in major roles, John Banner, that lovable, affable dude, is kind of terrifying in that film.
Right.
I mean, there are moments where there's like real menace coming off. So once the main characters were cast, Feldman turned to the supporting characters. And again, we see chance and connections working. Like Richard Powell suggested Ivan Dixon for Kinch because he had worked with Dixon in a Black Writers workshop.
And just to be clear, Richard Powell is one of the main writers for the show, especially early on.
Correct. Another actor who was being considered for Kinch, his agent asked who else Feldman was looking for. And when Feldman said, I need a Frenchman, he immediately was like, oh my God, I got a guy for you. Because he also repped Robert Clary, who was then primarily known as a singer. And ironically, Feldman had seen him perform, and Feldman was like, oh, hell yeah. And Clary never had to audition, which I think is awesome because I want only good things to happen to Robert Clary. I mean, I know that he's passed away, but still.
The basic truth here is that, like a lot of television productions in the 1960s, or probably even today, casting Hogan's was a combination of who one knew, who seemed to fit, and who would likely draw in viewers. And in this case, Feldman also needed certain accents because he had already decided that he wanted a kind of League of Nations of characters in the prison. So the American characters all seem to have come from the U.S. Army Air Corps. And that fits because most American prisoners had come from the sky at that point in the war. The pilot episode claims that the camp is set in Germany in 1942, although the plots of the various episodes are never sort of chronologically consistent. But there is that subtitle in the very first episode, it says 1942. And so the only possibility is basically on the US side would be Army Air Corps pilots and crew. British actor Richard Dawson was brought in to play Newkirk, playing a British Allied soldier. And Robert Clary, who we'll also talk about later, played the Free French soldier LeBeau. Now, putting all those Allied nationalities in the game or in the picture was a relatively easy decision, even for a pretty jingoistic American audience. Because after all, the leader of the group would be an American, so that makes it all okay. And Feldman even specifically remembered that he wanted Hogan to be an all-American, middle America type. And that was, in fact, why he rejected Richard Dawson for the role, who was originally considered for the Hogan character.
Right. And interestingly, the producers decided to include a Soviet prisoner among the crew of heroes. Now, this was coming during Brezhnev, just a few years after Khrushchev and the Cuban Missile Crisis. So Leonid Kinsky played the part of Soviet Sergeant Vladimir Minsk in the pilot episode, acting as the expert tailor and costumer who helped create cover stories for the heroes or those he was helping, which kind of went to Clary's role afterward. But to include Kinsky, and thereby acknowledge the overwhelming Soviet contribution to winning the war, during the 1960s was not all that common.
Yeah, it's historically undeniable. I mean, the Soviet army
Right.
absorbed the vast bulk of the German army, and Soviet society as a whole suffered over 20 million casualties. Nobody really knows a true number. But to bring it up in American popular entertainment was surprising. And one truly wishes, me as the historian of things, but also as a person interested in the history of television, I would really love to have been a fly on the wall during that decision making process. And in fact, the carnage and horror of the war on the Eastern Front would be a consistent plot point throughout the show, in particular because Commandant Klink and many of the other German characters would seek at all costs to avoid being sent to that part of the war. And in fact, I don't think it's saying too much to claim that many younger Americans, certainly myself included, may have gotten their first sense of what, quote, the Eastern Front meant from its sort of lurking horror in the humor of Hogan's Heroes.
If these orders are not carried out, you and the messenger will be court-martialed, shot, and sent to the Russian front. That's all. What? Oh, yes, of course, Heil Hitler.
So let's talk more about Kinski, because his reaction to the show tells us something about how the actors and the public at large would initially react to a parody of World War II. Like Leonid Kinski left Russia after the 1917 revolution. He worked as an actor in Europe and then the US after arriving there in the mid-1920s. And perhaps most interestingly, during the war, he played a role in cultural diplomatic exchanges with the now allied USSR in choosing American movies to show in the Soviet Union.
Isn't that a crazy job?
I know, right?
I mean, it's just hard to imagine. And you're like, okay, watch this movie, and then your commissar is like, "You've got to be kidding! We can't show that."
Right. So his most famous screen role was as Sasha in Casablanca. He told Eugene Harness, author of Round Up the Usual Suspects, The Making of Casablanca, that he was cast in his role as Sasha because he was a drinking buddy of Humphrey Bogart, and cast in Hogan's as Minsk. And ironically, he had worked with John Banner before Hogan's. He declined to continue after the pilot, saying that, quote, the premise to me was both false and offensive. The Nazis were seldom dumb and never funny. And can't really blame him.
No, and there are actually several versions of the story as to why Kinski will leave the show. Another version of the story has him say, and again quoting, "The moment we had a dress rehearsal," and I want to back up. I want you to imagine this from his point of view, from someone who lived through the war and who had seen the Russian Revolution in 1917. The man had been through a lot. He says, the moment we had a dress rehearsal and I saw German SS uniforms, something very ugly rose in me. I visualized millions upon millions of bodies of innocent people murdered by Nazis. One can hardly, in good taste, joke about it. I was, and am, at peace with myself concerning stepping out of the great success of Hogan's Heroes, unquote.
And totally understandable. When Kinski backed out, it may have been an easy decision for Fine and the studio not to replace him. Like, in fact, others associated with the show suggested not that Kinski quit, but that his character didn't quite work, which, may have been a cover for him quitting politely, but also may have some truth to it. Like, it's not hard to imagine why. The Cuban Missile Crisis had only just passed. And the movies Failsafe and Dr. Strangelove both came out in 1964, even as these decisions were being made in production. So a friendly Soviet prisoner, to the producers and, thinking about the American public at large may have felt just a little bit out.
Yeah, I can easily imagine that coming up in discussion. And the other thing that's interesting here is that Kinski is not the only one who sort of reacts badly to the notion of making fun of the Germans. Some of the critics and viewers were very uncertain about this possible trivializing of World War II. And there were a flurry of interviews associated with the first 2 years of the show in which the cast clearly felt obligated to downplay those concerns. The first piece about the show in TV Guide, for the younger amongst you, TV Guide was regularly sold on shelves in grocery stores and told you what was going to be on TV for the next week. But the first piece about the show that was published in TV Guide back when the show was premiering called it, quote, World War II with a laugh track, and in fact referred to its kind of improbable premise.
Right. And in that interview, Crane referred to the show as being a crossover between Combat and McHale's Navy, which is an odd claim from the start. But
right, Combat being a very dramatic portrayal of combat on an American squad in World War II. McHale's Navy, not dramatic, and it's very comedic and sort of slapstick.
So in the interview, he clarifies just a moment later when he says that he refused to do scenes that are purely like McHale's Navy. And what that seems to mean is that the prisoners are never to be buffoons.
Right. They can and do, and constantly do, make jokes. They're constantly joking with each other and about the Germans. But part of what makes the show digestible, I think, for Americans at the time, is that the Nazis are the buffoons, not the Americans. In that same group interview, Banner pointed out that even in a totalitarian country, humor gets through. And he argued that, quote, it's wonderful to be able to laugh again. A program like this shows that the mind is stronger than all the weapons in the world, and that even in a totalitarian country, individualism sneaks through.
What a very important thing to remember. A program like this shows that the mind is stronger than all the weapons in the world, that even in a totalitarian country, individualism sneaks through. It's wonderful to be able to laugh again. Like that just, that just feels really good to remember right now. Anyway.
And then it was interesting. He stopped and he added a crucial caveat. He said, just so people don't get prisoner of war camps mixed up with concentration camps, you can't make fun of a concentration camp.
That said, this distinction is both very real and a little too neat, right?
Yeah,
like POW camps were not concentration camps, especially on the Western Front. But in a later episode, we'll discuss what maintaining black and white distinction between the two obscures. Even so, that distinction continued to pop up in other interviews. It did in the article about Robert Clary in November 1966, who had survived 3 years in German concentration camps. Like asked directly about the comparison of a POW camp to a concentration camp, Clary just like shrugged it off. He was like, not even close.
And even setting aside the issue of one camp versus another camp, the whole premise of Nazis in a comedic show, the actors felt like they had to address it. And so Banner did another interview just on his own in the spring of 1966. And he claimed that Sergeant Schultz was not a Nazi. And at least one reader of that interview in TV Guide wrote a letter to the editor, as you do. People, used to write letters to the editor. I guess they still do.
Well, we have comment sections for that now.
Yes, that's right. Don't read the comments. But the letter to the editor was published, and the viewer complained about the show in general as, quote, upsetting, unquote, because it presented, quote, lovable, laughable Nazis. And then he complained that what made it even worse was that John Banner had said that Schultz is not a Nazi, which this viewer thought sounded to him like the claims of all of the accused Nazis in the post-war trials.
Yeah. I mean,
not wrong.
Yeah. And perhaps nothing encapsulated the early controversy more than the radio promotion voiced by Bob Crane that promised, if you liked World War II, you'll love Hogan's Heroes.
Pretty much everybody decided quickly that was a bad idea, that was a bad radio spot. And Crane later said that he regretted having done it. But even without that spot, there were still critics out there. And I think it's important to acknowledge the extent to which there was some real doubt about the laughability of the subject. So the New York Times and the Washington Post both blasted the show. And I'm going to quote several lines from these two reviews. They blasted it for, quote, the depiction of the Nazis as silly old buffoons, having more in common with Desilu Studios, that's the producer of the slapstick shows like I Love Lucy, than Hitler. And while the Washington Post worried that children watching the show would learn entirely the wrong lessons about what a Nazi really was, what they weren't was, quote, lazy, doltish, cuddly, lovable, and cute, unquote. And the reviewer for the Times did not hold back and said, there's something a little sick about Hogan's Heroes. And he called it an insensitive and misguided extension of Hollywood television's all too prevalent belief that anything and everything can be converted into cheap slapstick.
So the cast would spend years defending the comedy of this show. Clary, for example, with all the moral authority of an actual concentration camp survivor, responding to critics complaining that nothing is funny about World War II Germans or POW camps, said, quote, I think we make great fools of the Germans all the time. We are laughing at them. The only sympathetic one is Schultz. That's because he's on nobody's side. He's just as frightened as the prisoners.
And Schultz is regularly frightened. That's no doubt about that. And in fact, one of the things that he's frightened about that we talked about earlier is being sent to the Eastern Front.
To the Russian front?
But to this claim, the same Washington Post critic wrote that the claim that this is a comedy is, quote, no excuse. Comedy is supposed to begin with a believable premise, and then you have the exaggeration and distortion that provide laughter that can work. This, Hogan's, reverses the process. They begin with a premise that is ridiculous and continue toward the absurd.
Like, even as the show became a hit, as late as 1970, a professor of sociology, Martin Oppenheimer, which, ironic name, wrote a full column for the New York Times, reflecting on how Hogan's was the most offensive show then on television.
That's some really harsh criticism. We go back to the president of CBS rejecting the entire premise of a comedy about Nazis. When he first hears the idea, you can almost imagine his insides going, a guy who had been in charge, or not in charge of, but in the Office of War Information London, saying to himself, no. But then he's persuaded by the actual jokes and seeing Ruddy acted out in all of its sort of slapstick hilarity. So what is funny? What is okay to laugh at?
So ultimately, I think one of the things that we're closing in on and kind of distilling is that we laugh at things when it feels safe to laugh at them through either numbers or through like a general agreement.
And when Ruddy remembered that he and Fine's original pitch for the sitcom was based on ingenious convicts in a prison and that they couldn't find a sponsor for it, was that because prisoners were too close to the bone? Is that something that you can't laugh at? It's not safe. But for Hogan's, however, the studio head, with Ruddy's guidance, and encouragement and comedic performance, discovered that at least in 1964, it still felt safe to laugh at Nazis. And it was even safe to think of them merely as buffoons.
Right. They understood who the bad guys were. Some older members of the public, including Kinski and some TV critics, and briefly the CBS president, weren't sure it was yet safe.
But the watching public loved it.
Right. And Werner Klemperer later remembered how right it felt when they filmed the pilot.
Klemperer is going to have his attitude towards the show is going to be really complicated because of his own history with the Nazi regime that we're going to talk about in a couple of episodes. And so him saying that it felt right meant to, I think, that it felt safe.
Or if at least not completely safe, then at least safe enough and grounded enough in something that would be supported by either the public or a sense of righteousness.
And what you just said, it's grounded in they knew who the bad guys were. And when you said they knew, we mean they all believed with each other that we all agree on who the bad guys are. There's no debate. And
Nazis are bad, mock Nazis.
Yes, that's right. And Klemperer remembers as when he was thinking about the early days of the show that One of the things that happens in early 60s or mid 60s television is that you create a pilot or even just a pitch, and you take the pitch to the possible ad buyers. Because if the ad buyers don't want to buy ads on whatever you're pitching, then it's going to die. And Klemper remembers that when the very first two ad buyers that they took the pilot to, who watched the actual pilot, were General Foods and Philip Morris. And they immediately bought time.
Gentlemen, Miss Carol Channing.
My, how the General Foods kitchens have changed.
Welcome to Hogan's Heroes Dining Room. Case the door.
Oh, I love the decor. Did I interrupt dinner?
No, just finished another memorable meal from our talented chef, Corporal LeBeau.
Merci. And now, Colonel Hogan, for the dessert.
Oh, I pass. I'm too full.
But, Colonel, Jello gelatin.
If you say so, there's always room for Jello.
And that's a corporate decision. That's people in the corporate world who are assessing what they think the viewing public is ready to laugh at.
Just funny that Philip Morris, of course, in the 1960s, you had to sell your cigarettes.
Yeah.
The Flintstones has been brought to you by Winston, America's best-selling, best-tasting filter cigarette. Winston tastes good like a cigarette should.
And to get a better sense of how this thing worked in the 1960s, we're going to talk to Frank Conniff. And I am incredibly excited about this. I have been a fan of Mystery Science Theater for 50 years. And it's just a real treat to be able to have him on the show talking about this.
It really is. Welcome to the podcast. Frank Conniff is a writer and a movie curator, and perhaps most famously played Frank on Mystery Science Theater 3000. He was also the executive story editor on Sabrina the Teenage Witch, head writer on Invader Zim, host of Cartoon Dump, which was a monthly comedy and music review showcasing cartoons of poor quality. It was at the Steve Allen Theater. He was a regular and co-host on Tell Me Everything, and co-host on The Mads Are Back and Movie Sign with the Mads. And lastly, of course, on Cinematic Titanic. He's the author of several books, including You're Ruining the Dystopia for Everyone, Reform School Cinderella, How to Write Cheesy Movies, the only screenwriting guide you'll ever need, and 25 Mystery Science Theater 3000 films that changed my life in no way whatsoever. Frank, we've invited you on to our podcast today for a couple of reasons. One is your general expertise on the making of television shows in the 60s, 70s, and beyond. And we wanted to ask you about that process, the process of TV show design, of production, and of especially, for example, the way the affiliate system worked in the 60s. But we also wanted to tap your thoughts as a comedian on the nature of comedy, of what makes people laugh, what people find funny, and in particular, how that changes over time. Frank, you were born and raised in New York City, in Manhattan. Can you tell us a little bit about that and your family?
Yeah, I grew up on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and I lived there, in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And my father was a newspaper editor and a journalist. And I had like three brothers and a sister. We were kind of right in the middle of the whole media world of New York, and that's kind of the milieu, if I can use that word, that I grew up in.
Well, you say in other interviews that you've done that you had an early relationship with show business. When did you first know that you wanted to go into it? And was it always comedy, or was there something else?
Well, I was, pretty funny at school and around friends and around family, and I was always coming up with wisecracks, and I was always making jokes in class. I was a total wise ass, and most of my teachers were not too happy about that. I was kind of disruptive But I knew, I kind of sensed pretty early that I had a knack for comedy. And and like at the age of six or seven, I saw the movie It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, and it rocked my world. And there was nothing but comedians in it, and there was a lot of great comedians on TV back then. Jackie Gleason and Dick Van Dyke and all those kinds of shows. And so I was just kind of enamored of it. And when I realized that I might have a talent for it, it kind of really inspired me to think about that as something I do when I got older. And plus, my dad had comedian friends. My dad was friends with Jackie Gleason. Phil Silvers went to my parents' wedding. So it was just, there was the combination of just knowing that I had a knack for it, and then being aware of it as a real thing that people actually did. That kind of it kind of pushed me in that direction.
Well, that raises some interesting questions because you means your father, as well as you, had a real interest in comedy, and your father also was a combat reporter from World War II. Is that not right?
Yes, he covered World War II. He was 4F when he enlisted, but he covered the war. He saw a lot of action, a lot of battles and stuff. So that was very much, I think, what established him in his career as a journalist, was initially as a war correspondent. And then he also covered the Korean War and the Vietnam War later on. But then between that, he was in New York. He wrote a column, and he covered politics. And also he had a lot of friends in sports as well, which I never really got into sports at all. But that was like another big part of his world.
Well, that's relevant to our discussion of Hogan's Heroes, because you've got a person like your father who has a very direct, personal, and visceral experience of war through three wars,
Right.
and who's then seeing on television a comedy person who also has an affinity for comedy. And as you know, when that show first premiered, it was somewhat polarizing. Some people really felt that the world wasn't ready for comedy about Nazis, no matter how scripted. How did your father and the rest of your family react to the comedy of that show?
I just remember my father and my brother Tony arguing about it, and my brother Tony saying, "No, it's really funny," and my dad just being so offended by it, and just wasn't having it at all, And yeah, he was not a fan.
I want to come back and talk about how your career in comedy can tell us more about comedy, but I also want to start now asking questions about television production. One of the things that we're doing in this particular episode is talking about how the show was cast and how the producers made those kinds of decisions. And we see the role of networks, we see the role of agents, and we see the role sometimes of just outright chance. And I wanted to get a sense from you of how that basically worked in 60s television. How did that process sort of come along?
I think it was different than the way TV shows are made now. For one thing, my understanding is, sponsors were much more important. In other words, having a sponsor for the show. And also, Hogan's Heroes was produced by Bing Crosby Productions. So that was another aspect of big stars like Bing Crosby and even more significantly, Danny Thomas, who had production companies and produced shows that they were not a part of, but their companies produced it, and they made money from it, and probably got a tax write-off from having the corporation or whatever. But Danny Thomas, he produced his own show. He produced the Dick Van Dyke Show. He produced the Andy Griffith Show. He had a lot of success. I think a lot because of Sheldon Leonard, who was the executive producer of those shows. When a show got put on the air, it would get picked up for like 26 episodes, before it was even on the air. So, where you see now where shows are canceled after 6 episodes, after 13 episodes, shows back then that were not successful, like My Mother the Car and Occasional Wife, there's like 26 episodes of them. One thing that interests me as a comedy writer is that there were no writing rooms back then, which are a part of every show now. They're a big part of what the Writers Guild fought for in the last strike, which is shows have to have writing rooms. Back then, they didn't have them at all. The writing staff of the Dick Van Dyke Show is Carl Reiner. Eventually, he brought in Bill Persky and Sam Denoff, and then Gary Marshall and Jerry Belson. And those are the only people that were ever on staff. There was a lot of freelancing going on where writers would come in and pitch ideas for episodes. And then if they sold the pitch, they would go off and write an episode, and then the producer or the one story editor on the staff would edit it or change it or whatever. So it was a completely different system back then. And I think it wasn't until the 70s when they started having writing rooms. And, the variety shows back there, I should say, did have writing rooms. They did have staffs, like the Carol Burnett Show and Andy Williams Show or whatever. But sitcoms and dramatic shows did not have writing rooms. And some of the shows made back then were as good as anything done now. So it just makes you wonder. Although I, as someone who has worked in writing rooms, I am a complete supporter and advocate of writing staffs. But I think it's just as a comedy nerd, it's very interesting to think about. By the way, I Love Lucy was 39 episodes a year, and it had 3-person writing staff, one of whom, Jess Oppenheimer, was the showrunner, was the producer, and along with Desi Arnaz, did everything else in terms of the production.
That's a lot of writing in a short time.
Yeah.
And also presumably, therefore, not a lot of revising.
Probably not, but I think they probably knew what worked for Lucy. The same way Carl Reiner knew what worked for Dick Van Dyke and tailored their writing to them. And I think they figured it out pretty quickly.
Well, one of the things that people say about Hogan's Heroes is that many of the plots seem very similar to each other. They follow the same basic story arc. It's just a matter of changing the context of which secret German weapon is at this time that the heroes are trying to steal, or which set of prisoners are trying to be funneled through the camp this time. So one of the comedy transitions that we were examining in the process of doing the podcast was that how a show like Hogan's Heroes becomes a show like MASH, because in MASH you have much more of a character arc where the characters change over time and there's stability in the way they approach the world. Whereas in Hogan's Heroes, it's basically time restarts every episode. Yeah. Is there some way that makes sense in terms of the history of television? Is there a way in which the production has changed and expectations changed?
Well, I think that it all depends on the luck of who is working on the show. MASH was written by Larry Gelbart, who was a great comedy writer with a lot of experience, and it was just really smart move. And also Gene Reynolds was the producer who produced a lot of great stuff. So a lot of it just depends on who do you have to do your show. And I think in the case of Hogan's Heroes, I don't think the writing was ever of that caliber, Whereas in the 70s came along, you had Larry Gelbart doing MASH. You had James L. Brooks and Alan Burns doing the Mary Tyler Moore Show. You had Norman Lear with All in the Family. It really just comes down to who the people are that are making the show, and also how much they can get by the networks and get what they want on the air. An ideal Hogan's Heroes series would have been something that was probably darker than what it actually was. The way Mel Brooks did with the producers, and just went all out at the absurdity and everything. I think in the case of Hogan's Heroes, it was more just really sitcom writing that was very conventional and of that time.
Well, then that raises the kind of the next question, right? Which is that darkness was there. It was there to be tapped by a humorist if they so chose.
Right.
And the question then becomes, you say that studios might be afraid of tapping that darkness.
Yeah.
But what sort of, I know you can only hypothesize or speculate, but what kind of calculations do you think the studio execs were making about how do you make World War II funny?
Well, I think that a part of the reason that Hogan's Heroes was even on the air was probably because of the success of Starlight 17, which was a comedy in the early 1950s made by Billy Wilder that took place in a prisoner of war camp. It was a successful play before it was a film, and so that probably just is what made them comfortable with the idea of doing a prisoner of war camp based comedy. But I think what they ended up with, even with Nazis as the antagonists, it was still pretty much basically a workplace situation comedy. Colonel Klink was the dumb, clueless boss, and Sergeant Schultz was his minion, and then the Hogan's Heroes people were the smart employees who got one over on them every episode, and it was really nothing more than that. It wasn't any commentary on war or confinement or any kind of profound statement about anything. It was just basically a workplace comedy that happened to take place at a POW camp.
Wait a minute. Hogan! Hogan?
Well, look at me. I only work here.
Right. You know, that's actually one of the differences, interesting differences between Stalag 17 and Hogan's Heroes is that in that movie, as you say, also a play, there was a darker thread to it, but it wasn't even about the Nazis. It was about how prisoners could come to distrust each other and be afraid of being betrayed. And yes, it's absolutely a comedy, but it does have that darker thread that runs through it.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of it was about the wrong man being suspected of being the informant. You're absolutely right. It absolutely had that element in it. Hogan's Heroes was just basically hijinks at the POW camp.
Right. Well, you mentioned Gene Reynolds. He was actually a director on, I can't remember the number right now, but I think it was like 29 episodes of Hogan's Heroes before he moves to MASH. And so there is some creative continuity between the two shows. One of the things we're going to be looking at is how the humor changes. The humor in Hogan's, as you say, I love that it's an office comedy. It's made me think of, in fact, the show, The Office. There's a lot of similarities, the dumb boss and the workers sort of working around him all the time. But Hogan's has that we always win quality, and we're always making fun of the Germans.
Right.
When you move to MASH, you get a show that is, we don't always win. Sometimes we lose the patient. And we're not making fun of the enemy. We're making fun of the government and the army, where the satire has changed.
That kind of change in what was acceptable in humor and what we laugh at and opening up what we laugh at, I think that came much more from like National Lampoon and that kind of underground comedy that when Saturday Night Live came on, it was kind of brought above ground, and SCTV, suddenly you could do darker comedy. In the case of MASH, I think it was just really good character comedy and really good characters and people in an extreme situation and the community among all of them and the conflicts. It was a very human show, And to me, that's the quality of it. But I think in terms of the way we all changed and the way the culture changed, I think that came from the counterculture seeping into the mainstream of popular culture.
And do you feel like Misty 3K was a part of that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. We all grew up reading Mad Magazine and
Oh, yes.
reading National Lampoon. We all watched SCTV. We all kind of had similar musical tastes. We all listened to Frank Zappa, who was a very subversive force. And a lot of other people on other shows and other comedy settings, they had those influences in them too. Firesign Theater, just a whole different way of looking at the world and of doing comedy, and we were absolutely influenced by all that stuff. And the great thing about Mystery Science Theater is we didn't really have any network interference. I think a lot of it was because we were in Minnesota, and Comedy Central was in New York, so we were just kind of left alone to do whatever we wanted to do, and so all of our influences seeped into our work, and now some of those influences has seeped out to other things too. So,
Right.
So it's a cool thing. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that's true about Hogan's as well as Misty 3K is that you both shows last for a really long time in one way or another, in syndication, in jumping cable channels, in your case, having a giant Kickstarter and creating a long-lived program with fan bases that are really loyal to it. How do you imagine? I mean, we've been talking about how comedy changes. What is it about comedy that remains stable, that creates that fan base who just keeps coming back to that same kind of material?
Oh, I don't know. That's a difficult question. I think that what's stable is that people like to laugh. You know, people like to be entertained, and
Right.
But you can't really predict what it is that's going to stick. None of us, when we were doing the show, thought that it would still be a thing like 40 years later now, as it is. Um, you know, we were just making exactly the show we wanted to make, and I think that's the lesson is regardless of what your creative endeavor is, just do what you think is good, do what entertains you, and in the case of comedy, do what you think is funny. You can't think about if an audience is going to like this or not because you can't predict that. But also in our case, the thing that kept us going forever, which no one would have ever thought about in the Hogan's Heroes days, was the internet. You know,
Right.
that because of the internet, we became more popular than ever. We were seen by more people than we ever were when we were in production. So there's that aspect too. But it's very gratifying that people seem to really still enjoy the show.
Do you inject politics into your comedy?
You mean on Mystery Science Theater?
Yeah.
There's a little bit of it. You know, people ask about that, and you know, to us, like politics was just a part of popular culture. So in the same way that we would reference an old movie,
Right.
or a song, we throw a political reference in, usually a very dated political reference. We kind of were very self-conscious about not doing like what everyone was doing jokes about at that time. A huge comedy premise back then was like, I don't know if you remember Joey Buttafuoco,
Yep.
and you know, and also Lorraine Bobbitt. We didn't do hardly any jokes about contemporary stuff like that, and I think it's in the long run that was a really good decision, because I think it would have dated the show. And ironically, the show isn't dated because we did dated references on the show. So they're kind of, you either get them or you don't. We did hardly any Bill Clinton jokes, but we did Adlai Stevenson jokes. We did Estes Kefauver references. We did Eisenhower, Thomas Dewey, you know, and I think that was a good thing. I would probably cringe if I watched the show now, and there were jokes about Monica Lewinsky, and you know, a lot of that stuff, like that Jay Leno used to do about Monica Lewinsky. I mean, it's just dated so badly. It's kind of horrific, the slut shaming and all that stuff.
Right.
And we didn't get into any of that, which I'm very happy about.
Right. Well, that asking about politics brings us to kind of the political present, and all of a sudden, comedy is really in the headlines with the canceling of the Colbert Show, the firing and the unfiring of Jimmy Kimmel, the controversy over a comedy show in Riyadh, and that has led to questions about free speech, and also ultimately going all the way back to Hogan's Heroes, MASH, and Misty 3K, questions about parody and satire. How, I mean, just tell me what you think about the role of comedy in the free speech debate at the moment.
Well, you know, I think comedy has the same role it's always had, and I don't think that ever changes. And I also think the point of political comedy, and some of my fellow comedians, I think, will disagree with me about this, but I think the point of political comedy is like any kind of comedy. It's supposed to make you laugh and entertain you. I don't know if it makes any difference in terms of what happens in politics. You know, we comedians, we've been doing vicious Trump jokes forever, and he got reelected. He's the president. He's still incredibly powerful. We didn't really change anything, but what hopefully we did along the way was give people comfort with funny lines about him and or about what's going on. But I don't think comedy really changes anything. But that doesn't mean it isn't really valuable to make people laugh.
Well, in fact, I think you make a nice point about the function of laughter as a survival mechanism, and that's one of the other things that we talk about in our own show here, is about the role of gallows humor in very high stressful situations. That war and soldiers inspire comedy, sometimes very dark comedy, just to keep themselves going. And I think in a dark political moment, comedy can continue to play that same role.
With regards to MST3K and Hogan's Heroes having both legacy and longevity, I mean, you're not just TV's Frank, you're also TV's father of TV's son of TV's Frank, with you know, a kid of your own following in your footsteps. Are you a proud papa with a guy who looks interestingly like Patton Oswalt?
Yeah. You know, I wasn't part of the reboot at all. So when they kind of sort of recast my part, although he's my son, it really made it less painful than it might have been that it was Patton Oswalt, who's a friend of mine and who I love, and did a great job. And it's fun to be associated with it on that level. And also, you know, when Patton was he was promoting something else, but when he was like on Conan O'Brien and Jimmy Fallon, they asked him about it, and he gave me a shout out. And you know, that's the only time my name has ever been mentioned on the Tonight Show or on Conan's show. So I always appreciated that.
I hope it's the first, but not the last.
I have a feeling it'll be
that. Interestingly, MST3K was the first place that I ever really got an inkling of what Hogan's Heroes was about, or heard any of the voices. It's actually kind of a touchstone for a lot of my understanding of pop culture for some reason. I don't know. But you guys did a lot of mentions and like call outs to them, including the bannergram.
Oh wow, I barely remember that. We were all on board for doing John Banner references whenever we could.
It was brought up in The Simpsons a couple of times, and Werner Klemperer actually voiced himself as Colonel Klink.
Yeah, I remember that.
One of the very few Simpsons characters to be given a chin.
That I didn't know.
One thing I wanted to ask you about with Hogan's Heroes, but comedy more generally is this idea of like comedy being kind of a medicine, and you touched on that with regards to what comedians do, and
Right.
having it basically be kind of getting us through hard times. And what strikes me is that what Hogan's was to people was so varied. Like, your dad did not care for it, but other people are like, "Oh, this is wonderful. I get to watch Nazis get beaten every week. This is
Right.
this is
Mhm.
great." For the folks like Robert Clary, who went through Buchenwald,
Mhm.
or like Askin and Banner and Klemperer, who actually escaped the Nazis, do you think there might be some sort of like just fake it till you make it, like just hunker down and do the work and do the doing, and the feeling of being okay with it will come later? And I realize I'm asking you like for rampant speculation, but still.
Yeah, but I'm happy to speculate on it. I think in the case of Robert Clary, and I think for most performers in that situation, I think they just understand what it is. They know that that it's just supposed to be a light comedy show, and they're using and it takes place at a POW camp, but it might be the case that he's like, well, this is a living, so I have to endure this. Or he's like, this is a chance for me to act every week, and that's what I want to do with my life. So um and I would guess he wouldn't necessarily find it morally objectionable to do that, because it's just a comedy and they're using that, but there's a precedent for that. It's not like it was the first time it was ever done. Stalag 17 being the obvious example. The greater example for me is a movie made during World War II, To Be or Not to Be, directed by Ernst Lubitsch and starring Jack Benny and Carol Lombard, which is a brilliant, I can't emphasize enough, a brilliant, hilarious comedy that has Hitler is in it. All of the villains are Nazis. The villain that Sig Ruman plays in that, Sergeant Schultz, is really a knockoff of that character. And this was made as World War II was happening, but through the years, it's just established itself as one of the greatest comedies ever made, certainly in my opinion. Jack Benny, who was Jewish, said that his dad, when he saw him in a Nazi uniform, he couldn't handle it. He just freaked out and wasn't having it at all. So, but my point is that there are a lot of movies that have had Nazis in them, and I would make the argument that if a drama can have a Nazi in it, then a comedy can have a Nazi in it too, which some people would probably disagree with. But I think any subject that can be dealt with dramatically can also be dealt with comedically. I think it's understandable, the actor that said, I don't want to be a part of this. I can understand that, but I think I can even more understand the attitude of actors who are like, this is a gig, I'm a part of it, we're meant to entertain people, I'm going to give it the best shot I can at making it good.
And that was Clary's definite stance, for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah. That's where I would be at, for sure. I certainly wouldn't turn down being in a Mel Brooks project that had Nazis in it. And not only would I not turn it down, it would be all I could aspire to in life.
Fair.
Thanks for joining us, Frank. That was really delightful.
Thank
And
you.
I'm very appreciative of your being willing to come on and talk to us about all those different things. Comedy, satire, history of television. It was all really, really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're really glad to have Frank talk with us about sort of the nature of television in the 60s, and in general also the nature of humor. He's a very funny man. I think this has been a great start. I think we have a lot of momentum to roll forward into the next episode and talk about the individual actors and their lives as they were cast into the show. And I hope, and Anna hopes, that you will join us the next time.
Yes, I do.
And I want to give a shout out to my wife, Rhonda, who was very encouraging of getting this project off the ground in the first place, and who did some of the initial research for the genealogy and service records of some of the people we talk about in the show.
Thank you very much, Rhonda.
All right. See you next time.
See you next time.